All right, we're live.
Go.
So 2024 is on, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
So
this,
what are your thoughts? What are you looking forward to? What do you think is going to happen? Who are going to be the protagonists?
oh man, I want to take a step back and talk about what this year is going to be for Formula One as a whole, right? I mean, we're coming off of the Drive to Survive, COVID boost in interest in Formula One, and given the fact that it's Liberty Media, it's American company, and guess what? We love capitalism here in the States, right? So we're all about dollars and butts and seats, man. So I'm like I've been thinking about what the last 2 years have meant, and I really think that this is a make or break year for the sport. Not because of what the sport means for the people like you and I that love the sport no matter what, but I'm thinking about all the newbies that have come to the sport and all the extra dollars we've been spending on tickets, right? And so if that is to continue, which as an American, that's what I always want, to count more dollars and make more money, right? But in reality, right? I mean, this season has to be a good one for Formula One, and I have a few thoughts on that.
And what does a good season look like to you?
So a good season definitely looks like not one of the last two seasons we've had, right? Like a 22 and 23, definitely not 23. I think back to a few things, right? So Vegas turned out to be a good race after having probably the worst start that you could imagine. But again, by all accounts, everything was done with, right? The interest had sort of leveled off, and one of the things that became an issue, especially here, that was talked about a lot, is that tickets were sold at sky high prices, and within 2 days of the race, prices were down, somewhere between 40 to 60, even 70%. Of course, that goes to show you how high they were in the first place, but
Yeah.
if the sport is to continue and have that interest, it cannot be a championship, first of all, that gets decided, with 7 races to go or something like that. Like that definitely cannot happen. So, I'm thinking of many different things, but for starters, it cannot be what 22 has been, and it definitely cannot be what 23 has been. Like that's going to be a bad year.
Okay. And how do you think that's going to play out? Like, do you think that that's what's going to happen? Do you think it will be
So
a closer championship? Is that what your spidey sense is telling you?
Well, this is so this everything that we're talking about is my not well informed, not the least bit emotional, fully objective opinion, right? This is like hardly well researched opinion. This is all like this is I'm speaking from the gut, man, and I have a big gut, right? So these are gut feelings. But here's the one thing I'll tell you, going back to the popularity thing. When we came off of COVID,
Yeah.
21, which if
Yeah.
I don't know if we were really out of COVID then, but by all sense, we were starting to get back into whatever normalcy would look like. We had a great year, probably one for the ages, right? Especially with the way it ended, and maybe even you take out the controversial ending, and one way or another, that was a great season given how it was. And I think there are elements of that season that need to be repeated, right? I mean, we've had closer seasons in the past too, where two, three drivers were in the mix, two, three teams were in the mix, even right up until the end, right? But 21 was a special year, and I think 24 needs to be somewhere close to that, arguably better than that. And not because the racing isn't better or the cars aren't better or the marketing isn't better. Formula One's doing a lot of things right, especially here in the States where they're actively trying to grow the sport. But the reality is that some of the big sports over here have made their own comeback in a sense, right? And even soccer, which typically tends to be, somewhere between the fourth and the fifth watched sport, has, Messi in Miami, and so you're competing with stuff like that. So I really think that this season is a bit of a make or break for the sport, and in its current version and where it really wants to go.
Yeah.
Um,
So it sounds like you think it needs a story. Where's that story coming from?
oh man, the story can come from many different places, right? But so to answer your initial question of, do you think it'll be a close season? I have no idea. I have no idea. How could we possibly know that, right? I mean, how could we have known that Mercedes would stick to the same silly concept of a car that they had right up until first practice in Bahrain, and then chuck it all away, right? There was no way to have known that. I think I was, let's say, a bit more optimistic about Ferrari, but look, in reality, they were the only ones that won a race outside of Red Bull, so I guess I was right, right?
Okay.
Uh, so,
Couldn't
uh,
quite get second in the constructors though.
you know, hey man, look, don't do that. Come on, we won one race. Like, I feel like they should have given Ferrari a number two just based on that. It's like, look at this. There were what, 22 races, right? We didn't have 20 or 21, right? Whatever it was, right? I mean, who else but Red Bull won a race? Like that has to count for more. Like, hey man, that's the other thing they need to change. Like, you win a race at the end of the year, you get like one of these magic cards or something that add a like a bonus 25 points or something like that. Like I'd love
That's
to see
a
something like
that's
that.
a Bernie idea, man. He touted that back in the day as well. He wanted to give out medals for whoever won the most races, and that's how the championship was going to be decided.
How about
Uh,
qualifying? We would have been second had qualifying counted. Maybe even
yeah.
arguably first. You never know.
Why even have a Grand Prix on a Sunday?
Hey
You're
man.
right. You're
And if we
right. You're
counted
right.
practice sessions, definitely Ferrari would have won it by far. I haven't checked the math, but I'm pretty sure.
Practice
uh,
qualifying weekend over. Yeah. I
yeah.
wonder why nobody's thought of that before.
So I've been thinking about what all is needed in the season, right? And I'd love to get your thoughts on this, right? But the number one thing they need is a new champion. They really do. You just need it because people are wary of the idea of seeing a Max win weekend after weekend after weekend. And good God, we have 24 of these weekends, right? So that's half the year, right? We don't want to turn up to our sports news on a Monday morning and find out that Max has won again. Like that's not going to get anyone interested. So I don't know if that'll happen, but I do know that that needs to happen. Max cannot
Okay.
be a champion again.
Okay. So Omar, let's say that McLaren suddenly sort it all out and they have a car capable of not just capable but dominant, right? And they've got the pieces in place potentially to make that happen in the next season or two. So let's say it happens in 24, um, and Oscar Piastri suddenly forgets how to drive. So Lando is the clear number one, and he goes on a dominant run, winning race after race after race by 15, 20 seconds at least per race. And he gets crowned championship with 5, 6 races to go, the way that Max has. Would that be a satisfying season?
Yes. Here's why.
Why?
Here's why. Because we've seen Red Bull dominate unlike any other team in recent history, and especially for the newbies, right, that have come to the sport relatively recently. They don't know how Ferrari was back in the day, how McLaren was back in the day, all those runs that we know well and are well aware of, right? We would still tune in week after week, knowing what the last two seasons have been and expecting a different winner. So in that regard, having a new winner even be as dominant as they can be is actually a good thing. It's actually a
But
good thing.
but after 3 or 4 races, when uh, you know that Lando's going to be winning every race, does the novelty not wear off? I think it does.
So it might wear off. I'd have to think through your scenario a little bit more, right? But look, it's not realistic, right? Let's be honest. McLaren's not going to turn up every weekend be that dominant. You just don't make that happen right out of the blue. And
Yeah.
that, go ahead.
No, go on.
Well, everyone that's been watching at least for the last 3 years knows that that's not a possibility. Now, I'll give you this: if it is Leclerc doing this week after week after week, yes, it works. It works.
Because it's
And
a
this was one
Ferrari.
of one of the points I had much later on for us to discuss. But Ferrari winning, being dominant works. We've seen that work in the past, right? And we can definitely see
Have
that
have
happen.
have have we? Have we? Because
I,
I
I'm
would
com-
argue that 2004 was a very dull season,
yeah.
and people were switching off. Even fairly diehard fans were switching off in 2004 because that was not a good season. You
Okay,
know,
but again, think about this season coming on the heels of what the last 2, 3 years have been, right? Context matters. This is not any normal season. I mean, listen, by the way, if Ferrari dominating every race, oh my God, what a beautiful thought.
Yeah. Okay, so a couple of points, right? The first, though, if you look back at a season where something like that has happened, 2009, I think, is a good example.
Yeah.
You came off the back of sort of two seasons where actually it was quite well balanced between Ferrari and McLaren. I don't think we've had a season like that that often. 2021 was another repeat of two teams with fairly equal machinery. But we don't get that often. And that fed into 2009, where a completely different team, Brawn, came in and started winning everything. And I would argue that actually the first half of that season, after the initial novelty wore off, until Brawn really started to lose their way and Red Bull started to kick in properly. And remember, Red Bull were a new team in terms of race wins and championship contending potential at that time. So that was all novel. That season only really became interesting after Silverstone, I think, because Brawn started to drop off. You didn't know whether they were going to keep their championship hopes alive. Jensen started to perform badly, and Red Bull started to ascend, and there was a bit of tension in that story. But that worked because of that tension. And if that hadn't happened, I think 2009 would also have gone down as a landmark season in terms of the team that won it. But in terms of what actually happened on track, it wouldn't have been a classic. I would think the seasons that are more interesting are ones that even if the incumbent championship winning team still wins, actually it's an interesting contest. And the examples I think of as sort of 2003, in the middle of the Ferrari romp to 5 in a row, or 6 in a row actually, wasn't it? Because they won 99 as well as a constructor. That was a really good season. You had your favorite Kimi. He had one race win, and just through sheer consistency was potentially on for the title, and was there or thereabouts until the last couple of races of the season. 2018 was also another good example of that, I think, where Ferrari, actually you could probably count 17 in on that as well, but Ferrari came up with a decent car and a decent challenge, and certainly in the first half of that season you didn't know which way that was going to go. And that made it very interesting. Even if the ultimate outcome was that the same team and driver won, the fact that there was a bit of jeopardy in it, that's actually all I need. I need a bit of unpredictability. If the same person wins, but wins with a degree of unpredictability, that I think makes an interesting championship. And for clarity's sake, I didn't find 2023 boring. I actually really enjoyed it. There were lots of facets to it that until the very last few races, there was always some intrigue in, okay, well, this team's going to come with an upgrade. We've seen what McLaren have done. Can another team bring themselves up to the fore? Can they be the ones that are the team challenging? Are Red Bull going to have a setup error? Are Ferrari going to be there or thereabouts? And Mercedes going to be there or thereabouts? Has somebody else got a chance? Are they going to take that chance? And there were plenty of opportunities, I think, in individual races this season where the outcome wasn't completely set in stone. Like Vegas, Leclerc probably should have won that race without the safety car, right? So that individual race, there was a lot of intrigue in that race. I thought it was the best of the season, probably more than Singapore, because in Singapore, yeah, there were a bunch of teams that were in the running, but McLaren had sort of were sitting there. They weren't, Lando wasn't going to attack for the win. And it was interesting that Mercedes sort of really went for it, but they didn't really have enough laps to make that happen. And as soon as they weren't getting past Lando, as soon as George wasn't getting past Lando, you kind of knew where that was going to go as well.
Yep.
Right? Yep. But Vegas was a really interesting race. I thought that Hungary was a potentially interesting race as well. Silverstone was a potentially interesting race as well. There were interesting races here and there where the outcome wasn't absolutely set in stone. And that's all you need in a championship. You just need to have uncertainty. It doesn't I think it strengthens the achievement of whoever wins. So if Max is having difficult races every single race because his car isn't quite as dominant as it has been for the last few seasons, but he's still winning, that actually makes me more impressed with what Max has done than he has in the last season or two. And I think there's a lot of value in that. And I think um, that's something to be marketed and something to be shouted about, and something that people can hold on to, even if the ultimate result is the same.
Yeah, I would, so a lot of things to react to that. I would also agree with you that I didn't find the season to be uninteresting or any less interesting than I normally would. But again, I am talking about the my focus group of 15 new Formula One fans I know about in the United States, right? And sort of the general sentiment of that. And I think that Formula One has, whether we like it or not, made an active decision to focus in on audience growing the sport in every way, shape, or form it can, right? Including more races, more people, more money, et cetera, et cetera. So given all of that, I just don't think that this season was a good one for them. And the reason I say that is, yeah, between you and I and the folks that understand the intricacies of what happens race to race, how many things can go wrong, yeah, and that in fact never happened, right? Like, I mean, I don't know, maybe it was a third into the season where it pretty much became a conversation about whether Red Bull's going to win all of the races or not, right? And the reality is that they won all but one where they really probably could have even won that one had a few things broken their way. So yeah, I think you're right. I think we do need intrigue in the next season. In fact, that's something we should want every season, right? A little bit of intrigue, two, three
Yeah.
teams in the mix, maybe four teams in a good year, three, four drivers in the mix. I think we definitely need that. What I was trying to talk about more is that at the end of the season, you cannot have Max Verstappen standing on that podium again. You
Why?
need a new face. You just
Why?
do. You just do. Now, I mean, this is like 2, 3. Again, I'm not taking anything away from Max. Don't make me sound like a hater. I am not any of that. I think he deserves. I mean, look, man, he's getting right up there with your guy and being in that GOAT conversation. Especially if he wins it this year, that'll be four in a row. It's gonna start to look. We're gonna have a different conversation about that. So hats off to him. Kudos to him. He reminds me a lot of Kimmy in the way he approaches things as well. So I am down with that. I just think that in order for us to stay glued to our TVs, and by us I mean the collective us, we need a new champion. We need a new face from a new team, preferably, right? To kind of and be that Leclerc, be that Lando. I don't know about Piastri. It's a little too soon. I mean, to see that, but hey, even if it's Alonso for a change, it may not be the worst thing. Just kind of
Oh,
to throw something in there.
Alonso gunning for a title and actually in the running for it properly would be a sight to see, and I would be there for that 100%. I'm going to pitch something else to you though, right? That I think the whole point of getting new fans to come and watch races is that you draw them into the intricacies of the sport between races as well, so that they are more interested to get to know the stuff that's happening behind the scenes as well. But if the story that you're feeding them is one note, and I've said this before on other in other forums as well, if the story that you're selling them is just the on track who's winning, then you're going to find it really difficult. Trying to get a new audience to get excited about, wow, look at the achievement that Red Bull's dominance demonstrates is a difficult thing to get people to get behind. I don't think you can sell that. But there were more stories this season. One of the best interviews I heard was the oh man, do you remember what the who does this? Is Jake Humphreys does a podcast about peak performance, and they interviewed Alex Albon, and they talked about his journey from um karting, into cars, into Formula One, and how he dropped into a Toro Rosso seat and then became Max's teammate.
Mhm.
First of all, that story in and of itself, and the struggle that a driver needs to go through, and how they deal with that, how they deal with the highs and the lows, and how they motivate themselves to come back to a level that they are actually achieving their potential. And you can argue that Albon was one of the standout drivers of this season. That was a really interesting
So
conversation. But the other thing was he talked directly about what it is to be Max Verstappen's teammate and about how that team works, and you know, the age old argument about whether the car is designed just for him. That was an independent podcast. It's not, you know, the other episodes in that podcast are not all Formula One related. In fact, a lot of them are sports people and engineers and things from other sports, other walks of life. But that's the kind of thing that you would want Formula One to really exploit, to get those stories out there that other people are doing, but they're not really looking at because they're just looking at the one note. One of the things that I suggested was you've now got James Allison at Mercedes, you've got Adrian Newey at Red Bull, you've got Dan Fallows at Aston Martin, you've got Rob Marshall and David Sanchez at McLaren. You know, rather than just talking about the drivers, because it isn't just a driving competition, why are we not focusing in on the engineering side of things? And you know, in between races, what are these guys thinking? What do they have to do to get back on terms with the dominant team? You know, there's a battle in that as well, that in a season like 2023 was probably even more interesting than um, than the on-track action. And one of the challenges, that it's not up to me to do this, it's up to Formula One to do it, is to make the technology accessible, to make that interesting, to make new viewers want to watch that and get behind that. I think these are all avenues that they're so closed off at the moment. Like nobody's explored them properly or taken a look at what the potential is there. That we I still feel like F1 and Liberty is paddling in shallow waters at the moment, and they're not really looking at what the potential of this sport is.
are you sure that's a Liberty of Formula One decision and not the teams?
Well, I don't see the teams have
Well,
got anything to
the
do with
reason
that.
I think of it, and I think we think of it this way, I think the problem, the challenge with this sport is that there is a highly technical element of it, right? And you could argue, right? We always talk about, is it the car, is it a driver? And we talk about what happens if so and so was in this car and that car, right? And the reality is, on some level, for new audiences, and even for ones that have been there for a while, right? It's hard to grasp a lot of the intricacies that go into a sport, right? I mean, I know that you're plugged into it. I'm quite plugged into it. And yet, I don't, there are many things that I don't understand. I just simply don't understand because unless you are an engineer or have the mindset or the desire to think of life and the way you approach sports in that regard, right? There is a learning curve to it. There is a challenge and a complication to it. The whole idea of low downforce versus high downforce, high deck, low deck. Heck, even why are there different tire choices and why are there, and what happens to degradation and things like that, right? There are so many elements of the sport that are just so technical that it would just be, I think at some point it would be really hard unless you kept eliminating those, sort of technical obstacles, which then in turn changes the racing itself, which you probably don't want, right? It makes it hard for viewers, right? It's not that hard to learn soccer. It's not that hard to learn about how the NBA works or football in America, the American Football League, National Football League works. Those things are fairly easy to understand, even if they're intricate. And I think that racing as a whole is really hard in that regard. So that bleeds into your point about talking about the behind the scenes people, right? The engineers, the team bosses, even the mechanics, right? That's why Gunther Steiner, by the way, is so popular because he was a mechanic in one time, and that personality works. And I actually think they haven't done a good job of this with someone like him. I mean, you don't even need to look that far. The problem again is Haas this year has stunk, literally stunk. They've been nowhere, right? So I also think that it again goes back to the on track stuff. If things are more or less level, right? They don't have to be, they don't all exactly have to be the same. But if it at least gives us the feeling that there are folks in the mix, right? That from weekend to weekend, it could be, let's just say, fine, the winner is going to be, or the podium spots are going to come from these two or three teams, right? But even on a week to week basis, unless you're plugged in, there's kind of no way to know that, right? And that's the problem there. And I also think, and we can talk about this. I know you want to respond, but I also am starting to wonder if Sky Sports is the right outlet to do a lot of the international broadcasting on this. But I'll let you go on this one first.
I mean, I think the problem with what you're saying there is that you're trying to control the uncontrollable. Again, this is something I've said before, right? Is that you can't control what happens on track to a large extent,
Mhm.
right? You can create rules that will allow that are designed to have closer racing, or sporting rules, financial rules that bring the pack together. But until the cars hit the track, you have no idea whether that's going to work. And it may do, it may not.
Yeah.
That's not under your control. And once the season has started, you can't change that anyway. What you can control is the stories that you are generating from that. If a team has fallen behind because of a poor concept, what is their route back? Why are we not talking about
Well,
that
but
story?
that's the problem, right? A lot of those things are hidden, right? Like teams, I don't think want to give up their secrets, even if they're not doing well, right? Like,
But I don't think that's true, Omar. Like every single race, after the race, Mercedes do a debrief. Williams have started to do the same thing as well. And you're if those outlets are getting more and more popular, more and more teams will do it. Red Bull are starting, the Red Bull TV channel. Uh, they're constantly putting out interviews with Christian Horner. One of the best interviews I heard this season was the Horner Adrian Newey interview, where they got the two together and they were just chatting about how they got together, how Adrian Newey was recruited by Red Bull, what he does day to day, how he's got to where he's got to. All of the teams are doing those things, and it's in their interest to promote F1 in that way, because the more that they promote, the more eyes there are watching, the more money it brings in. It's a virtuous cycle, right? So there's no. I understand what you're saying about secrecy, and I'm not saying that the team should be giving up their darkest, deepest secrets about how they run their driver and loop simulator, or how their wind tunnel run program. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about you know, what have you noticed? Why are you so far back? What is your route back? How do you structure your team to make sure that happens? These are things that are out in the open anyway. So explain them, make that a story. You know,
I agree. I do,
and,
and
and, and those are things that you can control, where you can't control what's happening on track, because you can't control physics, and you can't control how the geniuses at particular teams are going to interpret the rules that you've just created. Now, I have a whole theory about the rules, and what the aim of the rules is, but we can talk about that in a second. But without changing the aim of Formula One, right? Without changing the actual pursuit of how that is achieved, of how winning is achieved, you're always going to have this problem that there are going to be in a sport where the aim is to create the fastest car and leave everybody else behind. If that is the aim, you're always going to have seasons like 2023, always, because
oh, I
one team's going to do that better than everybody else. So if that's what the aim of your sport is, then you need another story to sell, because you're never going to
yeah.
control that.
I completely agree with you. I think as good a job as Netflix did in bringing in new audiences, those of us that watch entire seasons recognize and realize how incomplete that is, and maybe at times how insincere that is, right? And I think that in the long term, big picture has hurt the sport, right? I think that they, for whatever reason, they haven't been able to crack the code on what it is to they can do to bring these stories up front, right? Even there are stories about drivers that we don't really know. Like, I mean, even Logan Sargent, for example, I read very little about him. I mean, I know it was a tough season for him, but would have been nice to be on board with his life story and get to know a little bit more about him too. And so what happens again is there's this deep level of concentration with some of the top teams again, right? Correlated with performance and or history, right? That if you have teams that, the top four or five maybe are intriguing, I think that the ones towards the bottom have not been covered. I mean, to be honest with you, I had lost track of some of the points and I didn't realize going into the last race that there were so many things at stake. And I was like, well, wait a second, this would have been nice to have known. Like we
Yeah,
should have
right.
been right.
100,
So
yeah, 100%.
yeah,
I
so
do understand. I do understand the Logan Sargent thing, though, right? That there has to be some linked good performance.
mhm,
And Logan, bless him, was at the back with no history, with no um, progression in his performance over the course of the season. He was the only person that was the only driver that was whitewashed by his teammate, right? The reason that Alex Albon's interview was so interesting was because he was linked to Max Verstappen, who is winning everything. So everyone wants to know what's the secret. What is it about Max that keeps him that makes him so good? And listening to someone directly involved with that and how they came out the other side of it, that's what makes that interesting. Listening to after things like Qatar, the first corner at Qatar, listening to George Russell and Lewis Hamilton having a banter between themselves, and their reaction between each other, that was actually interesting. It was lame in the end, like that they just shook hands and patched things up, and that was dull. But the conversations that generates, those are important, those are interesting. Logan Sargent crashing out again in Zandvoort for me wasn't particularly interesting. Maybe it was to other people, but there has to be a link to some kind of performance, to some kind of stakes, right? And
right.
and that's why those I think are the stories that can be deepened, that can be sort of looked at a bit more.
And into your initial point of, discovering the paths that many of these folks have taken, be it drivers, engineers, principals, advisors, whatnot, right? I think that's where one of the biggest issues is for Formula One ahead is why are we not able to hear more of their stories on a week in and week out basis? So I've watched religiously almost all of the pre-race shows, right? And they have by and large focused on either the team that is based out of, wherever the race is happening, or it's been one of the top contenders, really. And I think by and large, we haven't even heard a whole lot about Yuki. And that's a great story, right? I mean, even again, though,
Yeah, I agree with that.
those things can be, and that brings in new audiences, by the way, being a Japanese driver making on there, right? And why
Yeah,
no
yeah,
Japanese drivers have won virtually anything, right? Those kind of things are, I think, that are sort of left out there. So I agree with you. I think that the relation to performance needs to be there. And this is why, again, I think you cannot have what Red Bull had and this year, right? You cannot have that year after year. Once it's fine, yes, maybe two times, which they effectively did. I mean, even 22 really, after barring those first two DNFs, right? That was probably a very dominant season there. Maybe not winning all the races, but they were clearly head and shoulder
yeah,
above Ferrari
yeah,
in that particular season. So
yeah,
I think that 2 years in a row is too much. Having the hat trick here is really going to spell trouble, right? And then we head into 26 the year after. So the good thing about this season, though, as I think about it, is if I read it correctly, there are like 14 out of the 20 drivers on the grid are in the last year of their contract. I'm not sure if that's exactly true, but it's probably more or less true. Like at least half the grid is there. So I think that the silly season itself might end up being one of the saving graces if it does end up being another dominant Red Bull season, right? And all the right teams have all the quote unquote vacancies, right?
yeah.
So there might be a little bit of intrigue there, and I think that might be the chance for Formula One to capitalize, like
Yeah,
on stuff.
yeah. Transfer season is always good fun, isn't it? But yeah, I mean that was probably another reason why this season wasn't quite as interesting as it could be because I think I read somewhere that this is the first season ever where we're going to have no rookies and no changes of lineup across the entire grid. That's mental,
Yeah,
but
no,
not in a
indeed.
good way, I don't think.
Well,
there wasn't anything to talk about in the mid-season about that.
In the mid-season, and then you also lose out on talking about that in the off-season, which really, I
Hmm.
mean, I think one of the downfalls of having the type of season that we had is now the only question is, can anyone catch up? But I don't even know. I mean, how do we feel about what catching up looks like? I mean, are you going to have either of these other teams, be it McLaren, Mercedes, or Ferrari, be able to win more races than last year? Like, what are we talking about? Or like actually compete, right? Are we just hoping for Max to be sick one of the weekends? So then that turns out into being, I mean, I don't know, right? I mean, it certainly doesn't feel coming into the season that, you can legitimately put some money on one of the other teams winning, either
Yeah,
drivers or constructors. Maybe a constructors, but even that is counting on, I don't know, we Checo probably had a difficult season. I don't know that he deserved all of it, right? But they did fine. They did okay, right? So I don't know. Maybe that's a question coming into this year.
I mean, I think all of the teams have now got. Well, I don't think I know. All of the teams have now got 2 years worth of data on what these rules mean both to them and what they can see in other teams. Um, so the off season this year versus what it was between 21 into 22 is much more informed. They know what works, they know what doesn't work. Um, and I think it's a much more informed, refined decision making process. So I think we're going to see bigger leaps between 23 and 24 than we did between certainly 22 and 23, and certainly between 21 and 22. I think we're going to see bigger leaps in performance. Whether any of those are big enough to bridge the gap between where teams were now and where Red Bull was at the end of 2023, and whether that's big enough to then bridge the gap to where Red Bull are actually going to be in 2024, I think is difficult. Now, in seasons gone past, two things would happen. First is that the law of diminishing returns starts to kick in, and
Mhm.
and you'd expect that the dominant team, their ceiling starts to, they start to approach that ceiling much
Sure.
more quickly, and they don't have as much room to improve their performance, whereas other teams still have more potential, and therefore you might see a closing of that gap. But the financial rules, and I've been a big supporter of the budget cap. I think it's a great thing because it means that teams up and down the grid have got the potential to compete. But it does mean that if you've made a wrong decision at the beginning of the season, you don't have the resources to bridge that gap quickly. I think McLaren did turn their ship around, but I think um, those upgrades were there and coming anyway because a new engineering team had been installed that that hadn't been able to put their stamp on things right at the beginning of the season, but they did later on, and that's what allowed that big turnaround to happen. So McLaren, I think, will be there or thereabouts from the off this season. It's not going to be a case of they're coming from nowhere and suddenly having a big jump. That big jump, I don't think is really possible. I don't think you can realize you've made a mistake and rectify it with a brand new car in the middle of the season anymore. That doesn't happen. So that I guess is a problem, but I think the risk of it happening between 23 and 24 is much smaller than it was between 22 and 23. Just because there's a year of extra data, there's a year of seeing what the dominant team have done and what the and how they've done it, because we've had enough shots of Checo's car in the wall and being lifted up on a crane to know what the underfloor of that car looks like. Um, so I think I think there's reason to be optimistic that there will be more teams in the running, but it's not a guarantee.
Yeah, it's not a guarantee. And given that Max was winning these races by like 20 seconds, right? That really makes you wonder. And yes, Red Bull probably will. I mean, they already started working on this year's car, maybe a week after Ferrari and Mercedes did, something like that. Because
Yeah, I
you
think.
know, so I worry about how the season would be. I would really want to see a good fight in every race, right? Even if Max is going to win them, maybe that's the compromise at the end of the day, but maybe it starts to catch up in some way, right? And that maybe by the fifth race or the sixth race, he's been pushed enough to where you can really start to test to see what that looks like, right? I mean, it's been such a smooth sailing for him this last year, and maybe the half of the year before as well. So, yeah, I do think there's a good chance, but I have no idea. I mean, I don't know. I mean, you just brought up McLaren. I think they have a good chance of they seem to have figured it out early enough to where they can have those gains coming in, right? And then eventually catch up. But I mean, last I heard, Ferrari was changing their concept, and Mercedes has a new concept, and I don't know if it seems like a boom or bust type of situation, right? Like if they've hit it in the head, then who knows? They might be faster than Red Bull, and if not, then they might be right up there with Williams. Who knows? There's just no idea, no
Well,
idea.
I mean, if Williams are suddenly on it, that would be
That would be
a
great. Yeah,
major change. I think that's unlikely, but stranger things have happened, I guess.
yeah. Oh, indeed. I
Um,
think yeah.
yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be an interesting season. I can't tell you which way it's going to go, and I don't think anybody can. And that I guess is the crux of my argument is that you can't cheat physics, you can't predict physics, you can't
Well,
predict.
but I'd like to push back. We do know one area where it might go. Like I mean, with reference to one team. I mean, if you're a betting man, right? Are you not putting your money on Red Bull to
Yeah, of
win
course. Yeah,
most of the? Yeah. So I
of
mean,
course I am.
this
Yeah.
is my problem with it, right? You cannot come into the season knowing that, right? And then having no new drivers. I don't know. They brought Daniel Ricciardo back, but that felt more like a PR type of move. Like it just I don't know, like that, he's kind of sort of in there. He maybe doesn't even deserve that seat, given how well Liam Lawson was driving. I mean, it's, I don't know. I don't know.
I mean, I'd like to see a bit more from Yuki. Actually, I'd like to see Yuki in a car that isn't as peaky and unpredictable as it was at the beginning of the season. I'd like to see what he can actually do. I think he's been written off a lot by a lot of commentators, but it will be. I don't know what his ultimate potential is, and I don't think we've yet seen it. So it'll be interesting.
So how do you feel about the commentary team and Sky Sports' coverage in general? Because I'm a little bit down on them. Let's just put it that way.
So I actually think some of the things they do in the background are really good. Like you guys maybe don't get this in the US, but Sky on their actual F1 channel actually have loads of great stuff. They did a really good documentary about um, Villeneuve versus Peroni. That was a really good one. The Mansell story. Um, they did a really comprehensive documentary about the 2021 season, bringing in a lot of stuff that maybe people hadn't seen before. So all of the stuff they do in the background is actually really good. And on an individual basis, I still really like David Croft. I still think Martin Brundle has a gravitas to him that hasn't been surpassed yet. Um, I still think Ted Kravitz is honest and relays that honesty in a really clear way. I still think Karun Chandok and go on. I still think Karun Chandok has got some of the best analysis in the game. Um, is there room to improve? Yes. I've always thought the pit lane team have always been a little bit dull. That's not changed since the beginning of Sky's tenure. Are they still living a little bit in the old days in terms of like how they promote the sport? Yes. Do I have any better ideas? Yes, sure. That, as I say, there's loads of stuff out there from independent YouTube channels that far surpasses what Sky F1 do. Why they're not doing those things, I don't know. Would a different team come in and do something different? I don't know, because I've seen plenty of different broadcasters come and go, and all have come in promising something radical, and no one's ever done anything radical, particularly. Other than the BBC, actually. The BBC 2009 to 2011, the Jake Humphreys um, setup was probably peak F1 for me in terms of broadcasting. But there were interesting stories going on in the background at the time that they could sink their teeth into. And I don't think that's necessarily there at the moment.
Yeah, I one of the biggest issues I have with the way things are being done currently is that the guys, there are three of them, David Croft, Brundle, and Kravitz, they're just way too obsessed with Mercedes. They're
Are
just way
they?
too, yes, it is super biased. If you, and this is coming from someone who's watching it across the pond, right? So maybe I'm listening to it with different ears. They are just so. I've heard this phrase so many times. Poor old George. Poor old George. Like I'm like, please, please, come on. Like what does that mean? Like you are, covering every little bit about Mercedes in the way that they sound like they're cheering them on. Like they just are. I mean, and I would I would like to say it's British bias, but there's Lando on the other side. Who else is out there, right? Like I mean, it's crazy. They sound like fanboys. They really do. They especially Kravitz does, in my mind. And I remember vividly a lot of the times in the pre-race coverage where you know how the drivers come out and take their pre-formation lap, right? They kind of do a couple of setup laps and in that the way he sticks to George and Lewis in particular, it just annoys the heck out of me. It's like it's so one-sided. And in many ways it feels like, I mean, going back to the 2021 race being brought up again, right? It seems like they haven't let go of it. Like in many ways, they remind me of Abu Dhabi 2021 more than maybe even I want to, right? I mean, it just feels that way. And I don't know. I really think they need to change it up. Like I have loved seeing Naomi Schiff in the coverage. I think she's brilliant. Let's set aside the fact that there's a representation element to it with her being a woman and a black woman, right? But she is so poised. She's so great at she's so skillful and explaining things. Um, and a lot of times I try to read body language between her and the other crew, and they're always sort of like looking down at her. She doesn't get the opportunity that she needs to get. I would love to see more of her. I know she's not as accomplished as some of the other drivers. I know she's not an F1 driver and all of that, but for a moment, right? And maybe for a few races, I would love to have a different voice and a perspective kind of bringing that out there. Also
Yeah,
generational too, right? Yeah.
yeah. I mean, they've tried to bring in a female voice, and they brought in Danica Patrick, but yeah, I find her. Um, I don't know. So
That's the
some
closest thing they have, right? And a
yeah,
woman
but
to an F1 driver. So
I mean, she's not just close to a woman, Amar. She is actually a woman.
no, I know the closest thing they have to a female F1 driver is what I meant, which they don't have
Yeah,
one, but
yeah. She's just. I mean, the problem is that she hasn't raced in F1, and I think her views are slightly less well informed than others.
that's okay.
But
We're not always looking for the best information.
no, but my argument here is that it doesn't have to be a driver. Like that's the problem. Is that whenever Sky Sports bring in coverage, whenever they have their core team, it's almost exclusively drivers. The only times when it isn't is when they get Bernie Collins in, and when she comes in, she's great.
He's
I love
great.
Bernie Collins. Like she absolutely is pin sharp because she's been there at the sharp end recently. She knows what the plays are, and she's able to call things accurately and in a way and can explain things in a way that we can understand. Um, a lot of the outlets are starting to use Blake Hinsley as well of the Break F1 channel. Former performance engineer at Red Bull for Max Verstappen. Um, Even if you take that out of it, his explanation and his understanding of what is going on in a race, it far outstrips anything that anyone currently in the pit lane reporting group can do. But he I don't know if he wants to, and I'm sure he's been approached. But I don't think this is actually what he wants to do. But somebody like him being able to explain things the way that he does, that's what I want to see.
Yeah, but I
Like
think there's a simple
just
fix
just
to.
just but just having a rotating cast of ex champions just because they're ex champions, like
That's a
Jenson
bad
Button for
idea.
me doesn't
Yeah.
Jensen Button for me doesn't do anything.
Yeah.
Like I don't think he brings anything that I'm particularly interested in hearing because it's the same platitudes that I've heard from ex champions, for the longest time. Nico Rosberg is completely different. And Nico Rosberg, whatever you may think of him off track, and whatever you may think of him, in the time that he was a driver, mate, he's so
Oh, I
engaging.
love him. I love
He's
I want someone who can speak their mind, who can be a little bit reckless, right? I want that. If this the broadcast seems too prim and proper, with
Yeah,
the only
too
exception being,
pandering.
yes, it is pandering. That's exactly right to my point initially, right? Like the only part where it's looked a little more human, right? A little more entertaining is the grid walk. I actually look forward to those because I'm waiting for an embarrassing moment. I'm waiting for a cringeworthy moment. But outside of that, it's just way too much pandering. And it is in some ways way too technical at times where it just needs to be like, hey, I would love for someone to kind of, and Nico does this in such a great way, right? Because he's been a driver. He doesn't mind speaking his mind. And of course he's wrong many times, or maybe he's way out there. But I just love that.
Doesn't
Like, because
matter.
who cares? Yeah, exactly. You're not impacting. Can I tell you this? There's a more simpler fix in my mind to this. More team radio.
More team radio.
Yes, more team
Or
radio. I want to hear all the fights that are happening. I mean, think about it. Max and his engineer, that was fun to hear, right? I mean, that was fun. I love that. I want to hear Carlos correcting his end. No, I actually don't want to hear that. But in general, I think people would love that kind of stuff. Like more team radio is great.
But
Like
I think they do that anyway. Like I think they play out the radio that's interesting. If you want to listen to every radio like throughout the race, you can
every
do that
radio.
too. But
No,
you can do that.
I want someone's full-time job to just be picking the most salacious bits
But
of
that is what
radio
they're.
messages and sprinkling it in. It's not enough. More. I want more. I want more of that because I know that when those drivers are in there, right, they have to be saying a million different things. They have to be fighting constantly because, of course, that's the
But a lot of
situation.
it, yeah.
I
But
want to hear that. I want to
a
hear
lot of
that.
it will be really dull. But what I would suggest that you want is an entire different feed that's
Yes,
separate to the normal
doesn't
commentary.
matter. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. So if you want to make that suggestion, I think that's a great suggestion. It's
This
not
is
something that I would watch, but if that's what you want,
one
an
of
entire feed where it's just team radio,
I
go
also
for it.
loved I would bring back everything in 2021 that had to do with team radios and going back to to the referees of the race. Like I want that back. That was an
Ooh.
intriguing element. Do I think the decision making should be impacted by that? No, absolutely not. But
But
that
how
was
can it
a
not be?
lovely element of the 2021
It was
season.
so
I mean, come on, there
embarrassing.
are t-shirts made of Toto will say no, Mikey, no. I mean, come on, that is exactly what you need.
Mate,
These
it was
are
so embarrassing. It was so embarrassing,
it's fine.
and it
That was
also, I think, led to like actual bad decision making on track.
I mean, it was a year full of that, right? And look, I don't want the outcome of the season or races to be changed by that, but I think from an audience perspective, that was a great thing because it really gave us, again, to your point, a little bit of a peek behind the curtain, right? Because right now, I know Sky brings on these team principles, and really outside of James Wells, I don't think anyone's really interesting. Like, I mean, they bring Christian on. He never gives an answer, right? Like he'll be asked, "What is the color of the sky today?" He's like, "Oh well, I looked outside my window and I wasn't really. I was wearing sunglasses." And you kind of like, and I don't like that. Like, why are you going back to him? He's never going to say anything. I know they never speak to Toto live during a race. It's usually their director of comms or whoever that person is. I mean, Fred Vasseur was interesting, but that's mainly for my personal reasons. And I think Fred is generally a funny guy, so maybe that is okay. But in terms of like, give me something about the race right now, given how much it's raining, or something odd is happening, or there's a red flag, or this and that. Like, I want that. I just want to go to Gunther Steiner because he doesn't mind saying stuff. Like, just tell me things like it is. Don't sugarcoat it.
I think they could do that, and I think you'd be disappointed at what you hear. But
Oh
that's just
no.
me.
I don't know. I'd be sitting there picking bits from it, making up stories, feeding it to AI, and creating a whole lot of rumors. Like that's what you got to do. No,
Okay.
but I think again, the other thing that I also loved about 21 really was the intense rivalry between the two team principals. Like we haven't had that
Mm.
either in forever. Forever. Like those personalities going at it. I would love for that to be more of that. Like the only time we got anything close to that was in Las Vegas, and it had nothing to do with racing, to be honest. It had to do with the stupid water valve or drain cover that created all of this mess. Like that's the most animated thing I've seen in a team press conference. I want to be able to go to those on my YouTube feed every week and have two team principals go at it, maybe three
I,
of them.
I think you're going to start seeing it because I think Zach Brown, as McLaren start to do better, he's going to start getting more and more vocal because he's going to want the best for his team. One of the things that he brought out that he said in his post-season address, he's not the president, is he? But he put out a little statement, and he talked about the fact that why is it that there's only why is it that Red Bull and Alpha Tauri are basically owned by the same
Yeah, people.
organization?
Oh,
Who
yeah.
else has that? You know, this isn't something new. This has been a reality since 2006. So why it's now become an issue? Well, I think more and more teams are starting to see in a cost cap era that actually it's a problem, and Zach's been vocal about it. I think that will become a point of contention. I think he will be at the forefront of it. I think he's a very canny operator, and I think he might not be as sweary, outspoken, vocal as Gunther Steiner, but I think actually the way he speaks and the way that he conducts
Yes,
himself is
that's
very
okay.
interesting. I think
If
if Alpine suddenly start to um, actually start to perform, Otmar would have been a really good person to have. They don't have him anymore, which is a problem. Uh, Mike Crack, what can he do? What does he have on him? If Aston start to become more and more interesting, is Lawrence Stroll going to start really throwing his weight around? I'd love to see that. But I think for that to happen, the only reason it becomes interesting, and the only reason 2021 was interesting is because on track those teams were competing, and because there was a
yeah,
performance element to it as well. None of the stories I think off track don't work if there's performance. There isn't something performative to talk about on track. I think there were things to talk about on season in the 2023 season that F1 didn't get behind and didn't really plow. But just looking for stories when there aren't any there, I think is I think difficult. I
I
think that's
think
difficult.
I wonder if they had sort of hope that Ferrari and Mercedes would figure it out, right, and be in the mix at least, or at least have
2024,
close
man. 2024. Let's see.
2024. Yeah, yeah.
Fingers crossed.
But like I said to you last year, my guy Fred, he's gonna make it happen this year. This is gonna be the year where
Is
we
he?
come second. Yeah, where we do. We were.
That's your aim to come second. Great, Omar.
I mean, listen, this, I mean, you can't tell anyone in their right mind cannot tell me that they're thinking their team is going to come first unless they're Red Bull. Like you cannot. Oh,
I
it's
think the teams within themselves. I mean, yeah, even Toto and Lewis actually have said recently that they think it's optimistic to be beating Red Bull before 2026.
it is
But what else
optimistic.
have you got to aim for? Like you
Well,
got to aim for that, right?
I think what might end up happening, which I think is more likely, is you get these two or three other teams, right? Mercedes, Ferrari, and McLaren just fighting each other for second place. I think that's probably the best. Now, look, outside of maybe Red Bull getting complacent, I don't know. Maybe Checo does sort of, send it all in because this is more than likely his last year there, right? I mean, it's hard to
I
see him
think he
coming
does
back.
send it all in. I don't think
Yeah,
I
that's
don't think he's holding anything back. I just don't think his levels
yeah,
enough to
but
challenge Max. That's
I
the
don't know.
problem.
Like maybe he literally sends it in on the first corner, like that kind of stuff. Like the
Oh,
best thing we can
takes Max out
literally send it in. That's
every
it.
race.
Just like send it in. No, I mean I'm joking, but but I look. The only thing okay. What do you think is more likely? Checo beating Max in a few races, making it interesting, or one of these three teams catching up to Red Bull and actually beating them. I'm not saying catching up from 20 seconds to like 3 or 4 seconds, right? I'm talking about legitimately pulling out let's say in the first half of the season, 5 races from Red Bull. Like,
I think it's more likely that that will happen than Sergio Perez is going to win, is going to be beating Max on a consistent basis. Yes, 100%. Because
I,
Max knows his game now. That car has had 2 years of development based on what he wants, and what he wants is getting further and further away from what Perez can handle. Go and listen to that interview with Alex Albon, right? Alex is a guy that likes a really pointy front end, and he couldn't live with what Max can do, with what Max wanted, and that was what was making the car fast. Perez wants the diametrically opposite trait from his car in the first instance. To ask him to then live with what Max wants is not possible. I don't think that can happen.
all right. So we'll probably do a prediction show maybe before the season starts, but I, for one, am looking forward to Checo sending it all in, like literally sending it all in, like qualifying on the front row and just doing to Max what Max has done to so many others all these
Just,
years,
just not going to
just
happen.
just pushing him off track, maybe making someone else's life easier. Maybe Lando comes in from behind. I think, well, by the way, I would say I'd counter McLaren catching up to Red Bull. Like if I don't think Ferrari or Mercedes will. I just whatever they're deciding, unless they hit the jackpot, there's just no way to see them being in the mix for a legitimate
Yeah,
victory. Like
I just
don't
think there's
just
more of a chance of one of those teams hitting the jackpot this season than there was in seasons prior because they have more knowledge.
yeah. Well, if that's the case, let it be the men in red that hit the jackpot. You
Who knows,
guys have won
man?
quite a few of yours already. Like it's
I
time
think
to
they need to bring Mattia back. That's my answer.
bring him back at Mercedes. You like the concept so much, right? You like his stupid car so much. Like get it in. Like I don't. And
I'd have him, man. I would definitely have him. The
your guy.
the 17 and 18 Ferraris were right up there. And as
Okay.
soon as they stopped listening to him,
We did. Now, listen, and if you're a Ferrari fan, you don't care about coming second. Like, come on, that's not. This is the problem with you. Like, stop being so reasonable and so.
maybe hire a driver that doesn't crash into the wall at the slightest touch. I don't know.
I don't know. Carlos has been fine. What are you talking about? He's our race winner this year too. Like, what are you talking about?
I'm not talking about Leclerc. I'm talking about you know who I'm talking about. I think Charles was a standout performer of the last few races of that season. I thought he was unbelievable.
I
I
think they
think you
brought
give
the car back towards him. Like whatever they did, they
yeah,
did bring it
yeah, but
back
that's what
towards
they
him.
need to do because they need to make a car that Charles can live with because Charles can live with a car that has a better potential.
I don't know.
I think the science. If you build a car for what science wants, you are hampering the ultimate potential of that car. Because I think the car that Charles wants is a quicker car. It's a car with a tighter front end, a slightly looser rear end. But that in this era, just look at Max, is what is going to win you races and titles.
Well,
So
I
if you can
think
build a car as extreme as what Max can handle, and I think Charles can handle that. If you can build a car like that, Charles on it.
they need to build a car that levitates, so then there's no tire drama. Like that's what they need. They just need a car that that goes on its tires in a straight line, and then when the turns come, it just sort of levitates through the turns and makes it through. And therefore, we have no tire degradation. We go, all but one lap of the race on one tire, then make a quick change. We're out there 50 seconds ahead. Boom, we're done. That's the type of dominance you want. Like, and then that's what you want. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, this is, I guess there's intrigue in not knowing where this is going, right? Maybe that's it. But the only problem with all of that is that one team looks like it's so far ahead that it's hard to imagine anyone catching up to them. And really, the question is, how much further ahead are they going to go now? And maybe
Yeah,
even
we'll
if
see.
someone catches up, like, I mean, we haven't really put Ferrari in a situation where their strategy is going to be tested essentially, right, for a year and a half. So who knows what that
Yeah, true, but
looks like.
they absolutely got it right in Singapore, didn't they?
It-
And you know, a lot of that was down to the driver in the car, but
exactly.
you know,
Did they though? Did they? Yeah, exactly. To your point. It
but
it it again seems like the drivers have to do the driving and the strategizing. So man,
and actually, I thought Charles started to come into his fore as well. Actually, that you know, in the last race, allowing Checo to get as close as he did and allowing him even to get ahead of him with the penalty that he had. I actually thought that was very clever because if that race finishes the way it finishes, Mercedes are guaranteed to have second in the constructors. If you try something a little bit different with a bit of logic behind it, you may have a different outcome.
Yeah.
Red Bull threw him an opportunity, and he tried to take it. I like that.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think I mean, in the end, I would love to see, Ferrari be in the mix now. I think the popularity of the sport outside of my own biases is a lot higher when they're in the mix. They just need to be in the mix for it. And they need, because even for half of 22, right? When you kind of sort of knew that they were throwing this away, like people were actually tuning in to see what they would screw up with. Hey, like let's see how they're gonna mess this one up, right? Like, and you don't have that anymore, and you really just want a season where you have hope, right? No hope
Yeah, yeah,
equals no fun. So, who knows?
yeah.
Maybe Mercedes has found the cure, and they'll turn up with a rocket. Who knows? And it might end up being one of those things.
We'll
Yeah,
see. We'll
yeah.
see. There's a lot of intrigue, I think, between now and then.
All right.
Right.
Okay.